Very good.
All right, so I was asked to say something about the traffic ops plugin system that's going in Go as everything moves to Go. I don't know if there's really half an hour of stuff to talk about here, but I'll try.
Can you make it a bit bigger?
Text size plus.
Sure. This is just the PR, so it hasn't been merged in yet, but I think we have some consensus on the list. So hopefully it'll be merged in fairly soon. But the PR is here if anybody wants to actually check it out and play with it. So again, I'll go over it. Is that readable? Sorry, what? So it's modeled very closely after the plugin system that we put into Grove. It's essentially a compile time plugin system. Compiles into Go. It offers, again, essentially, is that off the screen?
Yeah, you're overscan sitting. That works too.
So it's modeled closely after the Grove system. Again, it's a compile time system. The way it works is you add your file. In fact, I'll open up a file first. You add your file to traffic ops Golang/plugin, and then you add an init, which gets called when Go first starts up. And in your init, you call add plugin, and you add the hooks that your plugin will need, and that's really all there is to it. So this is the Hello World plugin. The repo will include a number of example plugins showing how to do all the features in addition to the README. And this is really it. So you call init, add plugin. That number there is a priority, which you'll see in a minute when I look at the plugin framework itself. And then you add your function that hooks in. This is the on request. We check that it starts with the prefix that we're looking for our request. And if it isn't, then we just don't handle it. And if it is, we do whatever we need to do. Again, that's really all there is to it. So this little bit, again, is the same way Grove works. And it feels a little awkward at first. Why didn't we add a hard-coded way, just like with the routes, that you could register a route? Well, the reason is that this is significantly more powerful. So, and in fact, I believe it's more powerful than the plugin system in Perl at the moment. So this allows your plugin to do really anything. It doesn't have to handle a route. So for example, maybe you want a plugin that handles multiple things. And there's an example proxy plugin to kind of sort of do microservices or something like that. And you'll see that in a minute. So maybe you want to handle multiple routes. Maybe you don't want to handle a route at all. Maybe you have like a log. Maybe you want to log somewhere or do something on every single request. So by doing it this way, it gives us quite a bit more power. And it's just a little bit awkward to have all of your route plugins check that prefix. But yeah, this is really just it. This is what a plugin looks like. It's a couple dozen lines. So we can look at the framework itself. So the entire framework, again, Grove works the exact same way. So if you're familiar with Grove's plugin system, you can probably just stop listening. It's really not any different. So it's, 200 lines of code. And a lot of that's just boilerplate. So this plugin file, it's plugin.go. So it's just traffic ops Golang plugin.go. That's really all there is to it. There's nothing else as a framework. The traffic ops application itself will call the functions in this to do what they need. So here's a function to list. I'll show you that in a minute. You can list all the plugins in the binary. So if you want to script something to make sure the binary has all the plugins you need, the PR also puts that in the RPM. So when you do yum info, you'll get the list of plugins. So that you can verify that your plugin for your organization got compiled in. We get the plugins, that's what used as well. Get enabled gets the enabled ones, so you have to explicitly enable plugins. We did that in Grove as well. So again, just like Grove, in the traffic ops config, which again you'll see in a minute, you have to specify which ones are enabled so that all those hello world things aren't enabled, or if you have something experimental. And that also has the really big benefit we found with Grove is that if something goes wrong, something goes sideways, you can just disable a plugin that was a little dangerous and you have a problem. You can disable it, you can do a hup, and traffic ops Golang, just like Grove, should reload its entire config on hup and dynamically stop serving that risky plugin. Load config. Every plugin has its own config. Again, exactly the way Grove works. The config is a plugin JSON key in the cdn.conf, and it'll have the name of every plugin. And you can literally have any config object you want, and each plugin that needs a config will register a hook for the config loading that takes the JSON raw message, which, if you're unfamiliar with in Go, is it's an alias to byte. It's essentially a half-processed JSON object that Go gives us the ability to process other things and defer processing on that, and then your plugin can come in and do its config again as any valid JSON object that it wants or needs. Again, this load funcs just loads the plugins, not something you need to worry about unless you're extending it, I guess. And this add function, again, is the function that you'll call in the init that registers your plugin. It takes a priority for the ordering if ordering matters. It's essentially arbitrary, and it's like it says in the README, all of the default ones that come with it will probably be 10,000. That's what I did with Grove. It's really arbitrary, and that's just the base number we went with if ordering doesn't matter, and then you can go higher or lower for your organization's proprietary one that it does. So right now we have these hooks. So what we found with Grove was really that it was best to just do an organic kind of growth for what hooks we have, as well as what data those hooks receive, rather than trying to hypothesize everything that we could possibly need. We just add what we need as we need it. And again, we would encourage you, if you're writing plugins for traffic ops and you need data, you need hooks, add them and make a PR. It should be fairly straightforward. You just have to add a hook function here, call it at the right point in traffic ops Golang itself, and it'll call the plugin. So again, here's the data that plugins are given. This data is an anonymous embedded object in all the other data. That is what everything needs. The config is that plugin's config. Again, it's an empty interface here because it can be any Go object that is a valid JSON object that you need to read. So it has to be an empty interface. Same for context. Again, it's exactly like Grove. If you're familiar with that, every plugin has a context that is passed through every hook for a single request. So if you have a plugin that needs to do an on-request hook and then maybe we don't have these hooks yet, but maybe a startup and then an on-request and then a during request and then an after request, and you need to pass some kind of computed data during that request through the entire thing, you can put it in this context. It works very similar to HTTP contexts, which are not only in Go, but a lot of languages have that general concept. It's just a context of if you need to flow it all the way through. Shared config. So every plugin also has access to a shared config that, again, you'll see in a minute in the cdn.conf. Something we discovered with Grove was that we frequently wanted to have multiple plugins that read the same config. Otherwise, we would just have to duplicate that same config, whatever it happened to be. So this gives you a way to say, this is a shared config by all of my plugins, and it has whatever you need. It's a map of strings so that you can have keys as an object. Again, that was just an incident of Grove that we just found that was useful. It also gets the request ID. Every request has a pseudo-unique ID. With Grove, they actually roll over because we get that many requests in, the overflow in UN64, but it's quasi-unique, and you can use it to track requests and do things with them. And then the app config is the cdn.conf. If you're familiar with traffic ops development, config.config is the cdn.conf and all of the stuff in there, and plugins are given access to that. So yeah, that's basically all of the common data, and then you can see here the on request also is given the response writer and the request, so that again it can do anything that any other request handler would do. And again, most of the rest of this is just boilerplate. It's 200 lines of objects of registering these functions. sorting them by their priority, and calling all of the plugins when the hook is called. So again, just to add a hook, you would essentially duplicate this for one of the hooks. You would do the same thing. You would, for every object in the slice of plugins, you would call that object, give it the context, and process. And again, we only have 2 right now. We'll probably have more in the future, just as we discover what we need. So again,
You would list all the books.
all the hooks,
Sure.
well, those are code. So those are right here.
What did you say, Rob? You only have 2 what? 2 plugins currently?
2 hooks. So there's technically 3. There's the load one to load the config, and then on startup when the application starts, and then on request.
You don't happen to have an example of how you use this plugin system to extend the API or override an existing endpoint?
Yes. Well, you could do that with the proxy one.
So you did implement the proxy thing?
Yes, and I'm going to show that real quick. So yeah, why don't I show?
One question about you said you get config.config from, so basically you can have raw database access on a plugin as well?
Yes. So if you need, if you want to write a plugin that accesses the database and builds, a crconfig 2.0, what you really literally need, maybe you need React access. It does have raw database access. So yeah, kind of a caveat is it's exactly like Grove. If you write a plugin, you essentially have unlimited power. This is not a Lua sandbox. It's not like ATS's mostly sandbox plugins. These are unlimited power. You cannot just let a tenant or a user write plugins, not without significantly sanitizing what they've done. And again, Grove is the same way. So the idea is you can do anything you want, and
Designed
play
for
it safe.
CDN maintainers, not CDN
Yes.
customers.
yes.
So how's this going to work with managing the binaries as a byproduct of this with these plugins?
How do you
Are we
mean?
going to have a custom RPM for the 5 plugins I have in this version versus 10 more that got added later?
Well, there will be an RPM. So again, it's very similar to the way the Perl extensions currently work. In theory, because Perl's dynamic, you could drop a file in.
And that's
But-
what we do.
Right, but this is
A runtime?
So,
That's okay.
Without
because-
changing the RPM?
Even at compile time, that changes the hash, and with the hash change, then the version will change.
Right, so what this does is, again, it has a list of plugins that you can call with the binary, and that's also included in the RPM. You will have to build either a new RPM or a new binary. That's just Go, right? Go is a compiled language. We could have taken extra steps to use something like Lua. So the reason it doesn't use Lua, and again, these are all the same considerations we had for Grove. The reason we don't use Lua is for performance. Lua is drastically slower than Go, and if performance matters, it could be an issue. I mean, it was an issue with
performance.
Go.
It's just the management of these plugins and how we release them. That's what I'm wondering.
Also, from an ops perspective, you want to stay out of DLL hell, right? You want to not have random people dropping executable code
Right.
alongside your
Right, so-
version thing.
So I would argue that it's probably better to version your RPMs anyway rather than dropping arbitrary binaries, and then you don't know what's on the machine at any given time versus checking yum info
Yeah, well, let's
or
say that
Ansible.
I'm a
or
system
Puppet.
and I just built 3 plugins and I want to contribute it. And how does it get rolled back into the mainstream? In terms of the plugin,
By mainstream, you mean open
the
source?
master side, right? You put
So
it
you-
back in the master.
So you'd make a PR, right? So you'd make a PR to
Yeah.
open source. And again, those are strongly encouraged. We would like more plugins. We'd like more hooks.
What's when do you do something as a plugin and when do you do it as main code? Because it becomes kind of arbitrary. almost.
Right, it's. I mean, I think that question applies to any application you ever write. You could ask the same of ATS. We had the same question with Grove. As the lead kind of architect of Grove, I leaned really heavily towards doing everything in plugins. I still think that was a good decision. I think it made it more flexible. It made Grove's core more powerful to be able to have a very small core and a very powerful plugin system. Whether or not we do that with traffic ops, again, it's kind of arbitrary. I've personally gone both ways. I've done some thought experience of what if we did the same thing we did with Grove? What if we made most endpoints, or maybe even all endpoints, plugins? that might be better. It might make traffic ops more flexible, more dynamic. Somebody could say, I don't want this endpoint that's in master, an ordinary endpoint, and they could just disable the plugin. So I could go either way. We can have discussions about that on the list. It's certainly a very
Can you
powerful
override
system.
main stuff out of main?
Yes.
Can I do a plugin
You
app
can.
/API/1.3/server/
Yes, so you can absolutely do that. So you could do what I just said today,
Yeah,
I guess.
you can always do it, yeah.
It's just a question of how we structure the application. Yeah, you could absolutely say, I don't want this thing being served, override it. In fact, we have at least one plugin that's driving this at Comcast that we override one of the stats endpoints because we have a stat resource in addition to influx. And we do that, we override the existing one and it goes to the plugin instead.
Oh, so how's this going to work with the wrappers you got today in the TF Proxy?
So right now, again, there's essentially only one hook, and that's, again, just because we just needed the one hook. I suspect the right answer to that is in the future is we should write more hooks, that maybe you'll have an on request, maybe you'll have a before wrappers, before auth, after auth. That's probably the right answer. We went in that direction with Grove, and again, I think it went pretty well. You simply add the hooks you need, and if you need context for I need to do something before the auth and then pass that after, then you can pass that in the context. That again, that's what was driven in Grove is we had a need for a context. That's why it's in here is less an actual need for the context than what we needed it for Grove. We'll probably need it here. So yeah, if you like, we can look at some of these plugins. So again, there's a hello world for every concept that you can do with a plugin. So I looked at the hello world one a second ago. If we look at the hello context one, we can see how to pass context. So again, it's really straightforward. You simply assign any data you want. Remember, this is an empty interface in Go. You assign that in one hook, and in the next hook, you can get that back out and get the data that you passed in that request. So it's request specific. So one request comes in, calls start, you set this value, it calls on request, and you get the same value that you set back. It's just setting that variable in the startup data object. So we can look at a config example. So this is an example of doing the config, and again, if you've played with Grove's plugin system, you've already seen this. You have a config object, it's a struct in Go, and again, it can be anything you like because it's that JSON raw message. The config load, which is passed initially in the add plugin, you see we pass that load hook to be registered. That's called when the application loads, and it's given that object, which again, I'll show you in a minute in cdn.conf. It's given whatever object was in there for your plugin. You can unmarshal it as JSON, and then you return that as the empty interface returned by the config load, and then the application, traffic ops, will hang on to that and pass it to anybody, to all the hooks in the future, and you can see the startup. Well, not if I do that, you can. You can see the startup .config is the value that we set. Again, it can be any object here. It's just a string. It could be incredibly complex or simple. So here's the shared config. So like I mentioned in Grove, we found we had a need to share a single config object among multiple plugins. So we have that shared config. You'll notice there's no load here because, again, it's shared. That object is loaded or given to all the plugins, rather. And that's part of why the map was useful, is because there's no structure there, because we don't know what structure people want. And so it's easier to give it just a little bit of structure so that, maybe you have one plugin, maybe you have two plugins that need to share this bit of data and two plugins that need to share a different bit of data. You can give them different keys in that map. And it's just a little bit easier to manage. So here we're marshalling the shared config and printing it out. That's all we're doing. Again, it could be any object that has been set in that JSON config file. And I think that's mostly it. There's there's a startup plugin we can look up.
No, I write tests for these plugins.
The same way you'd write any other test. So if you've got your own build system, you have a proprietary plugin for your organization, for Comcast or Cox or whoever, then you would run your ordinary build that adds your plugins in, and then you would write an integration test or an API test that would, again, it would also be part of your system. We could add a plugin system or some kind of dynamic system. So one of the points of this system is to have everything self-contained so that we don't have merge conflicts, right? So I don't think our current integration tests really have that. I don't know if there's a need, but you could add an integration test just like anything else, and it would be your own Git, your own file testing your plugin. Unit tests are the same way. You could write unit tests. Yeah, something I didn't mention earlier, something that we recommended in Grove and is also in this README, is that all of your proprietary plugins, for your organization, Cox or Comcast or Quilt or whoever, really ought to have the name of your organization in them, or a unique identifier, a GUID, a globally unique identifier, so that you don't get merge conflicts. Because if if you're naming something like plugin/proxy.go, and suddenly we decide to add that to the repo because we want to add that, now you do have a merge conflict. So we highly recommend anything proprietary that's not going to be open sourced and put into master, prefix it with, Comcast hello config or Quilt hello config, just to avoid those merge conflicts. Again, it's they're all individual files. That's the purpose of the init system that these have, is they're all independent files, and they all call init. The purpose of doing it that way, I don't like magic as an engineer, but by doing it this way and having it in the init system instead of some central registry like the list of routes we have for routes, is that this file is completely self-contained. So that, again, you write plugins or extensions for your organization and you don't get merge conflicts with anybody else or with the main repo. Again, that's why we recommend prefixing them. And also the name of your plugin, which the only place that matters is the config. So again, I'll look at cdn conf in a minute. The name of your config in that conf for your plugin is the name of the file. And that also goes back to, again, I'm not a huge fan of magic, but it makes it much simpler to have, this is hello config.go, so hello config is the name of your plugin. Again, it makes everything self-contained, and hopefully you don't have any conflicts with the master or with anybody else writing plugins. So yeah, I'll go ahead and look at the cdn.conf that I keep mentioning. If you're familiar with cdn.conf, this is a cdn.conf, and you can see we've added a couple things. We've added the plugins, which has the list of plugins that are enabled. Again, it's the same as Grove. It adds a lot of power to and safety to disable those specifically if you have a problem in production. And then you have a plugin _config that has the name of your plugins, and you can see that proxy plugin that I haven't looked at yet. So the name of the plugin, sorry, bumping this. The name of the plugin is proxy.go, and so it is automatically given the contents of that JSON key. So this JSON object is automatically given to the plugin, and then it's up to it to parse it however it wants. Yeah, that's really pretty much all there is to it. So we can look at the proxy.
Like William's point, if I wanted to extend the API using the plugin system, I want to create an API get foods, then I want to test it. To test it, there has to be code in the TL client, right? So how we have to think about adding plugin architecture to the TL client, or should the TL client be auto-generated?
I will say I don't think that's a terrible idea, but it's outside of the scope of this
I don't think
plugin system.
the native client is an API the same way that the API itself is an API.
And if you're extending it, then you can extend the client if you
Yeah.
want to do that.
And really the
Right
client, so the client is self-contained as it is. So if you think about the client, we have files like servers.go, delivery services.go, and those files have the functions that are added onto the TO session object that is the client object. So if you needed to extend it, you should be able to just add a file like that. And again, it's a Git patch or however hopefully you're doing version control with Git. But you shouldn't get any conflicts, right? As long as it's named reasonably uniquely, you shouldn't have to add things to another file that might change. You should be able to make a self-contained file to do that.
So just like
So-
the hello plugin, inside of its own directory for the actual plugin system, he's inside the native client, you would simply add, hello plugin.go.
Right, and now that I think
inside
about
the
it,
existing package.
right, the API tests are the same way. So I think you'd be okay with the API test as well. If your organization says, we've got this plugin, we need a client, we also want the API tests, it should be a self-contained file. It should be fine without a framework to be safe and not have conflicts.
Do you, why wouldn't I just, use that proxy thing and have my own service and be done with it? Have it in a different code, not have all this merging and all that other stuff. What do I get over doing my own service and just pointing to it?
How do you mean doing your own service?
Using the proxy to having it in my own, whatever,
The microservice.
servers. somewhere.
Yeah,
What do
you
I get above that?
You get microservices, right?
Yeah.
So what do you get above? How do you mean having something in front, an ordinary proxy like Nginx sitting in front of traffic ops?
What I'm saying, maybe let me rephrase. So I can add some Go files and manage, I have the open source version, now I drop in some Go files, I gotta rebuild all that stuff. Or I can say, I'm just gonna make my own HTTP server that does my thing that I want it to do, and then point to it with the proxy and manage that independently. What's the advantage of doing it the first way?
Traceability,
Traceability.
in the sense that you don't have a network stack between your code that can go wrong. Also, it means that interoperability is easier to keep track of. It's one version to rule them all at that point.
Yeah,
as opposed to having multiple version interoperabilities you have to manage.
It's less operations work, so your operations team doesn't have to manage 2 services. You've got to maybe you've got a maybe you've got a 10-line.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things to be said for being able to scale.
Sure.
Yeah,
And
maybe you've got a 10-line
facilitates both.
plugin and you just need a single application. What I think what you're really asking is what's the advantages of a microservices or a smaller service platform as
Not
opposed to
necessarily.
something.
I'm
more
sort of
monolithic.
imagining myself as a CDN user. I got this traffic control, it's great, but I want to add one thing. Do I go down the path of doing all this, I'm plugging in a plugin in Go and adding it to this binary, or is it just not easier?
I think it depends on what you need to do. So if your one thing needs auth and it needs the database, or maybe it needs React, if you need all these things that are already built into traffic ops, then it's probably easier to write a small plugin.
Going toward those capabilities and, locking down the API.
Right, but if you don't need any of those things, or if you have them as separate services, maybe you've gone to some great length and you've written your own auth system and you're using plugins to manage that, or maybe you have a proxy in front of traffic ops and you're doing your own auth with that and not doing it with traffic ops, then maybe you do that. I mean, I feel like it's really a question of how you architect your system, but of do you want microservices, do you want a single service, a single RPM? Again, I'd say that's probably out of the scope of this, but this gives you the power to do both. Right, with these plugins, you can choose how you want to do it and do it either way.
And it even gives you the power for use cases like where you're not the developer of the plugin itself, right? So if you have, for instance, a black box DRM signer that comes from a third party, if they have an API that can be used, then you can use their black box certified code with the plugin remap plugin to make it look and act like it were part of TO itself.
Well, so why don't we look at this real quick, because this kind of addresses that question. So the question is, what if I want to do something more in the lines of separate services or microservices? This proxy.go that's in the PR is an example of how you would do that. So I think the other plugins have demonstrated it's pretty straightforward to do logic within the application itself, but here's an example of an external request. So we add plugin, and we have the load function. So there's an unmarshal function that just because I wanted a URL and not a string, it's not really worth talking about. And then we have the load. So this loads the config. straightforward. It's this proxy config that you can go back up to it. So the proxy config is just the path and the URI of the path you're mapping to, or mapping from, and then the URI you're mapping to. The load loads that, and then on request, we read that config and we check every path in the config and see if any of them match, which, as I said earlier, is if you want to handle multiple paths with a single plugin, this is an example right here of how to do it. And then the handle is simply a Go single host reverse proxy. It's a straightforward built-in utility. And then you also see we're getting the user from the rec, but we're throwing that user away. Why are we doing that? Because by getting the user, we require them to exist. So there will be a user error that they're unauthorized if they don't. And so this makes the proxy require authorization. If you wanted to have some kind of microservice framework that didn't use auth,
Yep.
you could just comment that out. Or, probably the better answer would be to fork your own plugin, make a, Comcast underscore proxy or Apple underscore proxy, comment that out. That's all there is to it. So yeah, this is a case in point of if you want to do things that way with microservices, you can do that, and then you can use as much of traffic ops as you want. You can see where we can check the auth, or you can not check it if you want. And that's an important thing to remember is these plugins, again, they're all powerful, essentially. They don't check the auth. So if you want to check the auth, you have to do it yourself. But you can, or you can avoid it. You can check the database. You can do anything you want, and you can call out to another service as well if you want. And again, if you saw that a minute ago in the config I was looking at, this is an example of that config. This is the proxy config. Takes a path and a URI. I could have put 100 of these in here, and it would have checked them all.
So that's sort of my concern is polluting this file with those routes. You might want to consider it.
Well, you don't have to do it this way. So again, this was just an example. You could hard code all of your routes in the plugin and say this is a plugin with my microservices that are at compile time or they're at runtime,
Right.
however you want to do it.
And you can say you have one parameter that is the pointer to where your individual directories are, right? Here's your myplugin.d config directory.
Yes, you could do that.
The APIs that will tell me my privileges in the dependency model. Like you checked if the user was logged in, but can I see?
Yes.
How can I see if I can do something on the delivery service?
Well,
or-
so this user thing that I just threw away,
yeah.
that is returned by get user from rec, that actually has that information. But if it didn't, it wouldn't be hard for us to add. And yeah, again, I fully
Because I think
support.
that may be an interesting part, right?
Yes.
To go through here and at least get your privileges, your tenancy, all that other good stuff. You guys spend
Yes.
a lot of time on that, so you don't want to repeat that in
Yeah.
the other service.
And we have spent a lot of time in Traffic Ops Golang itself trying to make API helper functions, and those work really well with this plugin system. So rather than a framework, okay, let's look at this real quick.
And is there something else than request handled? There's request unhandled, and it'll go
Yes.
back to traffic ops.
Yes. So sorry if I didn't mention that. You return whether or not the request was handled. This is just an enum for a Boolean. You can return request handled or unhandled. If it's unhandled,
It'll go back into
right
traffic
back.
ops,
So-
and if traffic ops would do something with that value.
right. So again, if you wanted to, for example, log every request in your own log or to your own location, you could do that and log things and pass them back.
Yeah, or you could, modify stuff
Yeah.
on the fly.
But yeah, it's a good thing you mentioned the helper functions, because I think it's worth going over this real quickly. We've tried to structure things less in a framework way than more of a helper function way in Traffic Ops Golang itself, and that will really be useful in the plugin. So if you're writing a plugin and you need to do this stuff, access the database, write responses back, there's a huge number of helpers in API/API.go. So again, write response raw, write response values, handle error, will handle, there's a kind of an idiom we do in this API.go of returning the status
Right
code.
Response raw that doesn't wrap it in the response.
Yes,
Oh,
and so
okay.
there
I
are some
just
endpoints
had- just
that we
right
need
into
to do that.
So what you're saying is I could write a GraphQL plugin.
Yes, you
Yeah.
absolutely could, and you should, and you should submit it to,
yeah,
a PR
you
because
bypass all of that.
that would be great.
And you could you could do all kinds of things, right? You could override any of them. You could make more secure stuff. If it doesn't work, you comment to plug it out,
Yeah.
right? These are belts and suspenders that you can enable and disable.
Yeah.
Have a wiener.
So yeah, there's a lot of helpers in API, API.go. There's also helpers in DB helpers. And again, I guess you'll just have to have a familiarity with the application if you want to use these helpers. Or you can obviously write everything yourself.
How easy is it to make traffic portal use a different start of the string, like /API/1.3? I wanted it to be /JVD, and then is that one big place?
And write your own
It's
traffic
tempting.
ops.
Very
So here's what
tempting.
you can do. You can do that. You can write your own traffic ops for every route, and you can make them all use GraphQL to generate.
Yes. It's very tempting, isn't it?
But again, that's the point of the system. It's something we found extremely valuable in Grove, I think, to let people write their own plugins. And if something is generically useful, hopefully we can get it back into open source and have a wide array in open source, just like ATS does. And if it's something you need for your own organization, you can keep that proprietary and hopefully not have conflicts.
So considering that you have a pull request out for this right now, and you started a discussion on email, I take it there was some feedback there?
Yeah, I mean, people wanted to see more things in the README, and so there's more.
The discussion was kind of closed, and I think
Yeah, well, that
good on
consensus.
that, right? I think it could be merged. I can't merge it because I'm not supposed to merge
Oh, wait, you can't merge stuff?
it. I'll not do anything on this project.
I'm the-
Well,
Getting there.
that's depressing.
Didn't fix that one.
But yeah, again, there's a README. A lot of that came out of discussion from the community on the mailing list, so I think it's good. It's not just my mind, but what other people said was, what can help.
Yeah, I remember.
It's 2513.
2513.
Glossary examples. Yeah, and again, we definitely want community involvement here. We, just like with Grove, we need more hooks, we need more functions. If you need something, make a PR and we'll add it. I'm sure there are dozens of things that we just haven't had a need for yet. So
It would be cool if you just flush all your commits. Meaningful.
sure.
How close?
Yeah, did we decide on anything?
No,
We didn't
not
decide.
that.
That's like the deal,
Any other questions?